Hey, my early American history people. I'm going to go over quick just some kind of supplementary comments to the Chapter 7 lecture that we started off on Monday, the 30th. Make sure that in addition to watching these kind of mini lectures where I focus on a few things, you take a look at the crash course videos that I'm going to be posting. Those videos do a really excellent job of discussing a bunch of the historical eras that we take a look at in our course, but they do so in a way that allows for a bunch of slickly made graphics and packages and visual learning that I just am not able to put together on the fly for this course. So make sure that you go ahead and take a look at those. There's a really great one on the framing of the Constitution that will be up on the website along with the link to this video. So make sure that you guys take a look at that. The we're on slide 19, talking about the structure of government. The Constitutional Convention really coalesced and got together all the plans that were offered. Really came together with the idea of the three branches of government, like we said on Monday. Also said the government needed to have the power to tax. Those were probably the biggest deficits of the Articles of Confederation government. So they knew they were going to fix some big structural elements in the government, but it was not clear how exactly that was going to work. The legislature, once it is agreed upon in the Connecticut Compromise, one house of the legislature is going to be a House of Representatives, where bigger states with greater population get more representation, and the Senate is going to be based on equality of representation, where each state gets the same number of senators. Now you've got to figure out how to count the people for the House of Representatives. Who's going to count in the population and who's not going to count in the population. And that is going to, trigger a new round of debates and a new round of questions that is going to eventually end in the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise is going to be essentially the next big compromise, and that's covered on covered on slide 22. So there's a couple of slides showing Independence Hall in Philadelphia. There's an image of Independence Hall. There's some revolutionary currency. That's interesting to look at potentially, but the big question in terms of framing up the government, once you get past the idea of the two houses in the legislature, is deciding who is going to count for representation. Obviously, the slave states wanted slaves, greater number of slaves to increase their representation in the legislature, whereas states that didn't have an abundance of slaves, mainly concentrated in northern United States, were asking for the new government to be framed up in such a way that it would not give the states with vast number of slaves more representation in the legislature. They finally decided on a 3/5 scheme of representation, where they would take 3/5 of all, quote, other people, and count them and add that count to the entire count of the population. So that would give some increased representation to slave states. But part of the deal was that they were going to be able to tax those states more proportionally, based on the fact that they did have increased slave property. So that was the 3/5 compromise. On slide 22, it talks about the limits of democracy. And essentially, this is recognizing that although we fancy ourselves in the United States as keepers of a democratic tradition, the Constitution really limited, really limited direct democracy. There's of the major institutions set up by our Constitution and our frame of government, there's only one institution that has any really kind of democratic feature to it under the original Constitution as it was written in 1787. That's the House of Representatives. The people were going to directly elect members of the House of Representatives, and that was going to be very democratic in nature, for sure. The Senate was going to be elected by the state governments, and so mainly the states would, exercise this power. They would inaugurate a new batch of state legislators that would then meet in the state capitol, and then they would choose on the most elite members of their society to send off to the nation's capital to go represent their states. So that was not directly chosen by the people. Senators were not directly chosen by the people. The president of the United States was going to be chosen through an electoral college. The electors were supposedly going to be kind of the elite citizens of each state. And so those elites, again, were going to make a better choice than the people directly could as to who should be the president of the United States. And then certainly the other major institution of our form of government, the courts, is going to be as far from democratic as possible. The people don't vote on justices for the federal judiciary. The federal judiciary is going to be appointed by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. So you've got two extremely undemocratic institutions coming together to appoint and to constitute a third institution, that is the United States judiciary, that is going to be very undemocratic indeed. So we really see the Constitution as it was written in 1787 is not democratic in the ways that we would tend to think of democracy presently. It's actually pretty undemocratic. And it relies heavily on state constitutions because to be able to vote for federal offices and to be able to vote for federal members of the House of Representatives, you had to be able to vote in the election for the most populous branch of your own state's legislative branch. So if you could vote for your state's legislature, you could vote for your member of Congress. That was leaving a lot of power in the state's hands to determine who was going to be able to exercise any kind of democracy at all. And certainly there were moments in American history where we see, as you look back on American history, you can see a bunch of times when suffrage has expanded and people have gotten the right to vote, expanded and expanded, more and more people have gotten that right. But certainly you'll see in the era of the Constitution, the framing of government, there are going to be some elections that people are going to be able to participate in, especially in terms of the ratification conventions of the Constitution. And then those same people are going to find themselves at mercy of their states, who are going to essentially take away their right to vote in a very real manner, very quickly. And that was going to happen to some free blacks in America. That was also going to happen to some women in America very quickly. So at least that's some limits on democracy in slide 22. Slide 23 talks about the framing of the Constitution, the division and separation of powers. The division of powers refers to the divide between the state governments and the national government. This is a concept known as federalism. This is the idea that state governments have certain powers to exercise in terms of our governance, and national government has certain powers to exercise in terms of our national government or governance. and we'll have necessarily a constant discussion between these two institutions of government about which government should handle exactly which aspects of our national life, our national lives. You can see that the dynamic of federalism is still being played out. The state of California has sued the Trump administration, the federal government under Donald J. Trump, almost 50 times in the last 3 years since President Trump has taken office. In his first term, the state of California has made no bones about claiming that President Trump has been acting unconstitutionally. And not to be outdone, President Trump has levied as many sanctions as, many sanctions on the state of California, and threatened to take away funding and threatened to take certain actions to try to push back against our system of government and against our government in Sacramento. So the big idea is that the people who wrote the Constitution feared concentrated power, and one of the ways that they wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be a concentration of power was to split that power up, split it between the national government and the state governments. And so the Constitution was an effective way to do that and set that up. The division of power between the national government and the state government, referred to as federalism. And then we also had a separation of powers. So another way to make sure that a government couldn't become tyrannical was to give it 3 independent branches and then force each of those branches to at least work with one other branch to do anything. So separation of powers is the idea that every one of the branches can do something to block the actions of the other 2 branches. You can think of this as a way to kind of make sure that no one branch can just go off and go rogue and start doing anything it wants to do. Certainly, President Trump had some ideas about things that he wanted to do as soon as he got into office. He said he wanted to build a wall, and Congress did not appropriate him the funds to build that wall. This is an example of checks and balances. This is an example of separation of powers that we can see in the Constitution. All right. Let's take a look at slide number 24. Slide number 24 talks about slavery. Certainly there was a debate over slavery. The big idea is this. There were people who came to the Constitutional Convention who thought that it was going to be the time to eliminate slavery in America. And certainly those people lost immediately to the people who believed that the Constitution was going to need to protect slavery. The Constitution does not mention the word slave at all, or slavery, but the Constitution does protect slavery in some very substantive ways. Probably first and foremost, the Constitution does not allow for the slave trade to be abolished before 1808. So the slave trade was going to be continued on in the United States for at least 20 years. After the Constitution was ratified. On top of that, there is another protection in the Constitution that says, and the slave trade was doubly protected. There's another clause in the Constitution that says you can amend any article of this Constitution. You can add an amendment that changes anything in the Constitution, except you can never amend the portion that says the slave trade will exist for another 20 years. Certainly, when the 3/5 compromise is agreed to, members from both sides realize that the southern states that have a majority of the slave population are going to have more power in the national legislature. And because they have more power in the national legislature, they are going to have more power in terms of electing the president. The electoral college votes are based on the total number of representatives each state gets in Congress. And so southern states are going to have greater representation, and they're going to have a greater power in terms of electing the presidents of the United States. For a very brief historical example, the first 10 presidents of the United States, a majority of them are from slave-holding states. So you've got George Washington, for the first 10 terms of president, you've got a bunch of Southerners. You've got George Washington, serves 2 terms from Virginia. Then you've got John Adams, who serves just 1 term. He's from Massachusetts, not a slaveholder. But then you've got Thomas Jefferson, serves 2 terms from Virginia. You've got James Madison, serves 2 terms from Virginia. You've got James Monroe, serves 2 terms from Virginia. So Virginia and slave states are going to be able to dominate the political power in the early United States history. All right. That's all we need to say on that. Slide number 25, an advertisement for slaves that appeared in Virginia, an advertisement in a Virginia newspaper advertising 100 slaves being sold. Certainly, slavery was protected by the Constitution. Slide 26 talks about the Constitution as finalized. Once you had the people in Philadelphia decide that this was going to be the best plan of government that they could offer the states, they offered it up to the states and said that the states had to agree to it by ratification conventions. So each state was going to elect some number of people to show up and debate this thing, and then they were going to vote up or down whether or not to accept the Constitution as it was written. It very seriously strengthened the national government. Everyone knew this. In fact, everyone knew that the convention was working on this. They didn't know exactly what the convention was doing because as the convention got going, they agreed to meet in secret, and everyone absolutely kept their word, and nobody leaked exactly what they were doing. And in fact, everybody knew that they were strengthening the national government, so much so that Rhode Island didn't even send a delegation to the Constitutional Convention. They thought it was going to be an absolute losing scenario for them, because Rhode Island was the smallest state, and it felt like it had a disproportional amount of political power under the Articles of Confederation government. So when the Philadelphia Convention was called, they knew that whatever came out of Philadelphia was going to recommend that bigger states got the power that they probably rightly deserved, and Rhode Island wasn't interested in that at all, so they never sent anyone. When the Constitution finally comes out and is presented to the states, it sparks a really, really high-stakes debate. Slide 27 shows the preamble to the Constitution as it was printed in a Pennsylvania newspaper. The Constitution was just distributed via media outlets, and it showed up in a bunch of newspapers, and people started reading it and discussing it. Slide 28 is the signing of the Constitution. It's a painting done showing the signing that took place on September 17th, 1787, of the people who made it all the way to the end of the Constitutional Convention and signed the document. Just because they signed the document, it didn't necessarily mean that the document was going to pass. As John Locke had written, the only legitimate government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. So the people had to approve this new system of government. Slide 29 says, how did the anti-federalist concerns raised during the ratification of the process lead to the creation of the Bill of Rights? So the debate over the Constitution was essentially two parties. The two parties were the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. The Anti-Federalists were against the ratification of the Constitution. The Federalists wanted the Constitution to be ratified as is. The Federalists believed that the strengthening of the national government was absolutely necessary and needed to be done in order to kind of effectively manage the governance of the United States. For a number of reasons. James Madison, obviously one of the leading Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, a leading Federalist, John Jay, obviously a leading Federalist, and these guys knew that, George Washington, a leading Federalist, these guys knew that the Constitution empowered the new government to become necessarily powerful enough to manage our national affairs. The Anti-Federalists, Federalists drew their support mainly from probably more successful citizens in terms of the socioeconomic strata, probably merchants that wanted to engage in international trade, knew they wanted a national government that was going to be able to really manage the creditworthiness of the United States. It was going to be able to put treaties and trade deals in force through an energetic executive. Those were the types of people that would find themselves on the Federalist side. The Anti-Federalists are going to be people generally that are more rural in terms of their occupation, more likely to be kind of smaller scale farmers, smaller scale artisans. They are not convinced that we need a much bigger, beefier government because the transactions of their kind of everyday lives are not that far-reaching in scope. So let's take a look at slide 30. Slide 30 mentions the first bullet point is the Federalist. The Federalist is going to be a collection of 85 essays that appears in New York newspapers, written by John Jay and Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, mainly by Hamilton and Madison, that's going to make arguments for why the Constitution should be adopted. These come out as kind of sequential articles in the newspapers, and they form a really excellent argument for how to interpret the Constitution, how to kind of think about why the Constitution is such a well-balanced document in terms of establishing a system of government. The Federalist, as a collection of essays, still is cited by many legal scholars. The current justice of this, the current Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Roberts, quoted the Federalist a number of times as he was being confirmed by the United States Senate to become the highest judicial officer in the United States. So certainly these were extremely tightly argued, well-written essays on political science and the operations of the new government as the Federalists thought it would play out. In probably the best two, I don't want to say the best two, but in probably two of the most noteworthy essays, Madison argued that the system of government was really going to work for a couple of reasons. Number one, and this goes to extending the sphere in slide 30. He said that in Federalist 51, he said that there is going to be this great system of checks and balances, and that is really going to make sure this new government doesn't start acting tyrannically. In Federalist number 10, he makes an argument to, quote, extend the sphere. He says that a bunch of governments that have been republics in the past, and a republic is a government that relies on some measure of democratic election, where the citizens elect someone to execute the government on their behalf. Traditionally, Madison says that most republics in history have been very, very small. And because they're very, very small, necessarily all the citizens have a common language and a common religion and a common history and some kind of common identity. And a bunch of anti-federalists who thought that this new constitution would never work, their argument was that this country was going to be too big and too diverse and too kind of chaotic and lacking any kind of identity. So though the different factions of people would simply try to oppress each other and simply kind of spin out of control, and it would crumble under its own weight. Madison says in Federalist 10, he says that it's more likely that this will bring stability to our system of government because he argues that essentially, since we're going to be so big and so diverse that there is not going to be any one group of people that is so secure in the idea that they will always be in the majority, that they will deign to oppress anybody. Madison essentially says if you feel like oppressing somebody today, the thing that will restrain you is the fact that you realize in such a large, diverse country, tomorrow you might be in the minority. And if you oppress somebody today, tomorrow somebody's going to turn around and oppress you. So he says that is going to be one of the keys to having a stable form of government. All right. So the debate rages on between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. One of the on slide 31, there's a political cartoon that raises a number of issues. It's pretty hard to make out. On slide 32, there is an engraving celebrating the sign of the Constitution beneath Independence Hall. There's a federal procession that shows the order of all the kind of workers and guilds and trade groups that marched in a procession in 1788, celebrating that the Constitution was passed. 34 talks about the slide 34 talks about the Anti-Federalists. The biggest gripe that the Anti-Federalists had was that this new government was going to be this very powerful thing, and yet there was no real easy way to restrain that government in any real fashion. Almost all of the states in the United States at this point, almost all of the early states had bills of rights that were listed out very specifically, very specific lists in their own state constitutions that said, our state government can never do this thing or this thing or this thing. And they loved the fact that those were included in their systems of government. They looked at the new national constitution and said, we know that this is going to be a very new, a very powerful new form of government, and yet for some reason we don't put a Bill of Rights on this new system of government. Anti-Federalists said this is the big thing that we are scared of. We are scared that a bunch of elite people got together in Philadelphia and planned a new government that was going to be able to take away the rights of all the other citizens. So, essentially, the Anti-Federalists held the ratification of the Constitution up until they got promises from a number of very well-respected Federalists, especially James Madison. And they said, "Listen, if you can't promise us that we'll get a Bill of Rights, then we are not going to vote to ratify this Constitution." Eventually, though, Madison made a promise, and people said, "Well, we respect Madison enough that we think he'll honor his promise." And so the Bill of Rights was promised by Madison, and the Anti-Federalists agreed to ratify the Constitution. And as they ratified, as they sent back the official document that said, "Our state ratifies," they added a little kind of a PS and said, "By the way, here are some of the amendments we would like to see in a Bill of Rights." And so James Madison took those amendment offerings and formulated the Bill of Rights that we know and love today. All right. There is a slide 35 that says there's a banner of the Society of Pewters carried by one of the artisan groups that took part in that New York City parade. Slide 36 shows the Grand Federal Procession banquet. Again, another extensive celebration took place according to the Federalist victory. It was going to be, the ratification of the Constitution was going to usher in this new era of a strong, capable government that was going to lead America to an era of prosperity. So there were celebrations aplenty as this thing was ratified. 37 kind of highlights the Bill of Rights discussion that I was talking about. Slide number 38 shows kind of a geographical distribution of where the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists kind of found their power. 39 is a political cartoon showing the ratification of the state of New York, and this was seen as ultimately one of the absolutely linchpin ratifications. If a bunch of other states said yes and New York still said no, there was no real hope that you would have a country that would be united as a people. Slide number 40 as another focus question. How did the definition of citizenship change in the new republic to exclude Native Americans and African Americans? Certainly it did. Slide number 41 talks about the national identity. The national identity, for a long, long time, obviously, Americans saw themselves as British for the most part, and they kind of had a social order that was modeled after the social order in Great Britain. The Revolution kind of provides a sense of national identity in terms of banding people together to oppose the British. With the end of the American Revolution, there is going to be a search for a new national identity. The Constitution says, "We the people of the United States," but it isn't at all obvious. There is no definition of citizenship in the Constitution. It doesn't say exactly who the Constitution is going to apply to. So there is a question of who is going to be counted, who is going to have political rights. And so the country is left to forge its identity. We look at slide number 42, talking about Indians in the new nation. Certainly Indians and Native Americans in the new nation were a very difficult question in terms of governance, in terms of society. There were probably three different kinds of ways of thinking about the Native American question. One one way of thinking about it was to say that, well, the Native Americans have got to be essentially just pushed further and further west. They need to be relocated further and further, and we just need to kind of get them out of the way. So we need to remove them. The second kind of way of dealing with the Native American question was, well, eventually, if we just kind of push them to the margins of our society, eventually they'll just kind of die off and disappear. They will be a vanishing race. Unfortunately, this was a pretty prominent thought in American society all the way through the 19th century. And finally, kind of the third way of thinking about the Native American population in the United States was to say, well, maybe we can assimilate them into our culture. This was going to be a very, very tricky, very tricky thing. There was going to be a number of people who were going to fight bitterly about how to deal with the Native American population in the United States. Certainly, there was going to be a bunch of military conflict. There was a great deal of military conflict as the new nation was starting out. This kind of came to a head. The military conflict was essentially concentrated in the Ohio River Valley in the Northwest Territories, because to a large extent the Native population had been pushed out of the 13 original states for years and years. In 1794, there was a victory by American forces that led to a treaty between a bunch of Native American nations and the United States. This essentially set up a system where the federal government would agree to pay tribes certain annuities, certain federal monies regularly. Tribes would cede the land to the United States in return for getting a bunch of money, but it ended up, diminishing the sovereignty of those Native Americans. Not all Native Americans signed on to this treaty, certainly, and sometimes within cultural groups, a portion of the Native American group would agree to a treaty, and a portion would say, no, we don't see this as binding. So that was certainly a very difficult situation to sort out. We look on page 43, there's the map of the Indian tribes. Slide 44, a medal issued to Red Jacket, a Seneca chief, during his visit to Philadelphia, the national capital, in 1792. George Washington offering a peace pipe. Slide number 45 shows an artist's rendering of the treaty at Greenville in 1795. That was the essentially one of the largest early Native American treaties that ceded Native American land to the U.S. government and obligated the U.S. government to treat those Native Americans to compensate them in return for those land grants. On slide number 47, we're talking about Black Americans in the New Republic. The status of blacks in the New Republic, very ambiguous, very kind of in flux. Certainly, slaves were held as slaves. They didn't have many legal rights. Certainly there was arranged slavery in northern states, where the slave population was not highly concentrated, did have certain rights, and slaves held in southern states that had a huge slave population had very different sets of rights, but probably kind of more baffling and confusing was if you were a free black American, where did you stand politically in terms of your rights and your status? That's going to be a very difficult question. Early immigration to the United States excluded black people. Said that the only people that were Congress was able to had the power to set up laws by which someone could become a citizen of the United States, even though it didn't define exactly if you were living in the United States. It didn't define exactly who was a U.S. citizen. So Congress set up a system by which the only people who were eligible to become U.S. citizens were white people, free white persons. Were the only ones that were allowed to immigrate and become naturalized U.S. citizens. So certainly, our notions of a national identity excluded Native Americans and excluded Black Americans. On slide 48, you've got total population of the total population of Black Americans in the United States. On 49, Jefferson, slavery, and race. I'm not going to try to summarize Jefferson's views. They are extremely nuanced in terms of Jefferson probably felt that Native Americans were on par with white people. They just were living in some kind of more primitive state of civilization. And in terms of black people, Jefferson probably thought that they were somehow innately deficient and were not able to be on the same footing as intellectually and morally as white Americans. Again, I'm not going to try to summarize Jefferson's views here because they are extremely difficult and nuanced to kind of grasp. There's certainly an excellent discussion of it in Foner's text. I would highly recommend to you taking a look at that. This is a picture of a black slave owned by George Washington, name of Hercules, on slide 50. Some of the founding generation understood how insidious slavery was. And certainly Jefferson writes in his notes on the state of Virginia that it's the destiny of these people to be free, but he doesn't know exactly how that's going to be accomplished. George Washington is going to absolutely free some of his slaves upon his death. 51, slide 51 says this is a runaway slave, an advertisement for a runaway slave. We've looked at these before, but this one is a little bit different because it's been taken out by Thomas Jefferson. So it's Thomas Jefferson advertising for a runaway slave that he wants to be returned to him. All right. And certainly the bottom line is that the principles of freedom, on slide 51, the principles of freedom for the United States as offered under the Constitution, again, continually in flux. You can see that freedom was certainly protected and guarded for certain groups of Americans. There was going to be a new national government that was more powerful and more capable of defending personal liberties for certain groups, but then there were also groups that were going to be completely left out, Native Americans and Black Americans, to be sure. So that's where I'm going to leave you. Again, please look at the video on the website. The crash course video that I'm going to link up there has an excellent discussion of the Constitution in terms of the structure and the functions of it. And then I will post up some thoughts on Chapter 8 in just a little bit. Stay safe.